Welcome to another episode of the Caroline Glick Show. Well, we're still meeting at a time of great tumultuous riots in Israel. I don't know, the media likes to tell us how many people there were. So yesterday they said there were 371,000 people at the riots in Tel Aviv. I don't know whether that's true. I found the number kind of hilarious. At any rate, I talked last week about the need to try to get to a compromise, and I was a big supporter of President Isaac Herzog's efforts to reach a consensus on judicial reform. But last week he gave his platform for judicial reform after 8 weeks of presiding over various off-record discussions, and suddenly he completely caved. I mean, President Herzog's platform that he put out for judicial reform would actually give the judiciary and the attorney general more power than they currently wield, which is almost unthinkable since they have limitless power, but it would actually place the limitless power that they seized for themselves without basis in law into law, so that it would legislate that they have the powers that they've seized for themselves from the Knesset and from the government, which is a non-starter, as Prime Minister Netanyahu and the members of the government and the coalition all said, and also members of the public themselves, because, this isn't what we were talking about. This isn't a compromise. If it's anything, it's a capitulation. And the question is, why did Herzog capitulate? And I think, I was thinking about it this morning, and he's not the first person who came to the edge and then he rushed back. Like, he was about to actually challenge the authority of the justices and of the legal fraternity of the attorney general, who's now acting as the grand commissar of the Netanyahu government, just as all of her predecessors did towards every government that has run Israel for the past 25 years, and overturning decisions of cabinet ministers without any basis in law. She has no actual legal authority, but then the inspector general of the police is going with her, and apparently the army is thinking that she's the ultimate arbiter of what's right or wrong. And I think that when you look at it, this is part what Isaac Herzog did. His collapse is not the first time we've seen something like this. And I just want to give you a couple of examples of things that we've seen that are very similar to what we just saw last Wednesday with Herzog, who, according to people who were involved in the negotiations that took place at the president's house, he had reached near consensual agreement of right-wing and left-wing jurists on a judicial reform package that was very similar to what the government has put out, in the sense, at least in the philosophical sense, that it took the judiciary from the level of high priests of Israel to the level of Israeli democracy and a co-equal branch of government with the legislature and the government. And why he did it? Well, let's just go and look at some things that came to mind to me this morning. In 2003, we had elections. Here was the first Knesset elections that we had since the collapse of the Oslo process in 2000 at the Camp David summit, when Yasser Arafat rejected statehood, and he came back and he ordered the Palestinian terrorist forces to organize for war and jihad, which he then launched in September of 2000. And 2001, we had elections, but just for prime minister, and the Knesset that had been elected in 1999 remained in force, and so the left continued to control the Knesset, and they joined Sharon's unity government, but it wasn't a right-wing government. It was a left-wing government that Sharon headed. And then in 2003, we had general elections for the Knesset. The left was led by Amr Mitzna, the head of the Labor Party, and Sharon was the head of Likud. And Mitzna ran on a platform of unilaterally withdrawing from Gaza, and he was laughed out of town. And Sharon completely rejected it, said under no circumstance it was the stupidest thing he had ever heard. It's complete surrender to terrorism, and Gaza would turn into Hamastan, and it would be too dangerous, and under no circumstances. And then in December of 2003, he won a landslide victory that year. And then in December of that year, he announced that by the end of 2005, there would be no Jews in Gaza, and that he was going to unilaterally withdraw from Gaza. So he had taken on completely the positions that he had just rejected, that the public had just rejected at the ballot box, that had been advocated by the head of the left, by Amor Mitzna and the Labor Party. And what happened between the election of 2003 and the collapse of December 2003? Well, Sharon discovered that he and his sons were under investigation by the state prosecution for corruption charges that they apparently had committed. That's what changed. And Sharon went 180 degrees, and he collapsed, and he surrendered Gaza to Hamas, and in short order it became Hamas then, and it went from being a tactical nuisance that it had been since 1967 into a strategic threat that it is today and that it's been for some time. And that was entirely a consequence of what happened to Sharon between the 2003 elections and December of 2003, when he collapsed and transformed himself into a leftist. The one thing that changed was his legal status and that of his sons. In 2015, Netanyahu was elected. He and the Nationalist Bloc won a stable governing majority. He formed a government, and he had an attorney general named Avichai Mandelblit, who wears a kippah, whose father, I think, was in the one of the revisionist, nationalist underground movements called the Lehi under or the Etzel under Menachem Begin, or the Lehi under Yitzhak Shamir. And so he was part of what's called the fighting family, and he was considered a right-winger. And he was brought in to be the Attorney General. I actually wrote against his appointment because he transformed the Judge Advocate General that he had been the commander of in the Army into something looking like progressive Judistocracy in the IDF, which was very bad. But all the same, this is how he was viewed. And there was a lot of effort on the part of the left to open criminal probes against Netanyahu based on a bunch of salacious rumors that all turned out to be false, that were published in Haaretz newspaper. And Mandelblit refused to open an investigation. He said there was nothing to investigate. There were no crimes of any kind that seemed to have transpired. And then a couple of things happened. The first thing that happened was, and perhaps the most important thing, the then chief prosecutor, Shai Nitzan, refused to close a criminal probe against Mandelblit about something that he had done or been implicated in during his service in the Army on the basis of no guilt. He said he would close it, but only because he couldn't find sufficient evidence to indict. And Mandelblit wanted him to close it because he was found innocent, that there was nothing to indict him on. And there was a whole hullabaloo, and that investigation was never closed. And then later we found out that Mandelblit said in a private conversation with a man named Efi Naveh, who was at the time the head of the Bar Association, that Shai Nitzan was clinging to his throat, that he had him by the throat, and that what was motivating Avichai Mandelblit as Attorney General was his need to placate the prosecution led by Shai Nitzan, who's considered one of the biggest sort of mafia gangster types in the legal fraternity that we've seen in recent years. He was Aaron Barak's. He studied under him, or he did his clerkship under Aaron Barak, and is considered his loyal soldier. And so Shai Nitzan, as the chief prosecutor, was holding the Attorney General by the throat over this open criminal probe against him. And Avichai Mandelblit collapsed. He ordered a criminal probe of Netanyahu. During the course of that probe, he rewrote statute based on a need to indict Netanyahu, even though they had found no criminal action by him. And so Avichai Mandelblit, accused of corruption, the investigation closed, held by the throat by the state prosecutor at the time, Shai Nitzan, opens an investigation of Netanyahu, invents a concept of bribery, which involves receiving positive coverage from a media outlet, and then said that Netanyahu sought such coverage and therefore he was soliciting a bribe, basically criminalizing politics and criminalizing journalism. But all the same, you have to indict Netanyahu of a felony, and so they made up a new concept of bribery, and they said that Netanyahu had to be indicted. And then you go to Herzog, and he was on the verge of presenting a compromise plan, and then instead he presented what everybody is referring to as Supreme Court President Esther Hayut's plan, which, as I said at the outset, expands the court's power, expands the power of the Attorney General to serve as a commissar the effective dictator of Israel who runs the country with an iron fist, and any policy that the government tries to adopt can be shut down by the Attorney General on whatever basis that she wants. And that's what's been happening since this government came into office. So I think, and there are other examples that I just, in the interest of brevity, I don't feel like going into, but what we're seeing very clearly is that for 20 years, we've had a pattern of nationalist governments, leaders being paralyzed by the legal fraternity, whether with criminal probes, threats of criminal probes, refusal to close criminal probes, of corruption allegations, and then using these actions to block the nationalist government from adopting its policies and intimidating senior officials into kowtowing to the positions of the left. And unfortunately, this has been going on for some time. I mean, unfortunately, there's only one way to block this, to end this, and that is through judicial reform. That's why it's so essential. You know, one of the things that we're seeing is that anybody, I was on television yesterday and I said, you know, the demand for judicial reform is not coming from politicians. Politicians see what happens to every single politician who tries to stand up to the legal fraternity, most notably, of course, Netanyahu's trial for non-crimes is going into its third year soon. People see what's happened, see what happens to everybody who tries to defy the court. And they don't want to touch it. The only reason that they're touching it is because they don't have any choice, because so many sectors of Israeli society, or the residents of the left that see the entire region of the country, of the Negev, just turning into this lawless area that's controlled by Bedouin crime gangs that are stealing land, that are putting up protection rings that make doing business impossible in southern Israel and increasingly in northern Israel. And they're not getting protected by the law enforcement or by the courts. To the contrary, those courts and the law enforcement arms of the government are kowtowing to the left, which supports the Arab crime gangs that are running the Negev and increasingly the Galilee as well. The people who live in South Tel Aviv, whose neighborhoods, their working class neighborhoods, have been overrun by illegal aliens from Eritrea and Sudan who have transformed their working class neighborhoods into crime-infested slums, that people are afraid to go out of their houses at night or during the day. And rather than protect their human rights, their rights as Israeli citizens, the Supreme Court has repeatedly protected the rights of the illegal aliens who have taken over their neighborhoods and their streets. The residents of Judea and Samaria, whose property rights have been seized by a court that wants them out of there, and their lands transferred to the Palestinians based on no claims through petitions that are put forward by foreign government-funded NGOs that operate in order to exist in order to essentially undermine the basic civil rights of Jews who live in Judea and Samaria. The ultra-Orthodox, same thing, who have been subjected repeatedly to violence on the part of the police and the court, refusing every single compromise that the Knesset comes forward regarding the draft of Haredi men into the IDF. It doesn't matter what the will of the people is. The court has a dictate, and everybody must follow, and if we don't, then governments will fall. So, sector after sector of Israeli society has been harmed by the court, and that's why we got the result of the elections that we received on November 1st. So the politicians don't have any choice but to go forward with the judicial reform. And when we look at what happened with Herzog, I think more than anything we have to see that his failure means that compromise is impossible, because any attempt to reach a deal is just going to lead to more blackmail. Any attempt to sort of prune the edges or to cut down the reform package is going to be met by more aggression and more aggression. And I'll just end my opening remarks with the following. This morning I saw this news brief that said that actually the attorney generals that receives through the president's compromise deal, she gets dictatorial powers to control every aspect of governance in Israel. So her people don't like the president's proposal very much, because in addition to giving her dictatorial powers, it also says that Aryeh Deri can be a minister in the government. So they don't like that. They want to both disenfranchise the 400,000 Israelis who voted for Shas, led by Aryeh Deri, and they want to have dictatorial powers. So his compromise is no good, because it gives lip service to the concept of democracy by saying to 400,000 voters for Shas that actually the head of your party is allowed to serve in the government. And that's not acceptable. So we see that even the smallest compromise is unacceptable to them. Even the smallest compromise on their unlimited powers is completely unacceptable to the legal fraternity. I'm going to turn over now to a conversation with Dr. Yoram Khazoni. We've had him on before, the author of Conservatism, a Rediscovery, and the president of the Herzl Institute, because I think that what we're looking at here is not really about judicial reform. I think we're looking at something bigger than that, and I could think of nobody better to talk about that than with Yoram Khazoni. So we're going to move into the larger question of what's behind all of this. What's the philosophical issue that's informing what we're seeing in Israel? But at the end of the day, as experienced, as lived, as the progressives love to say it, or where this lived experience of living under judicial tyranny means that if you so much as think about going against the position of the left on any issue, strategic, national, whatever it happens to be, you may very well find yourself under a criminal probe. So that is what so many people have experienced. And I don't know exactly what stood behind Herzog's decision to collapse, but given that there's a pattern, there may still be a pattern. I think there probably is. Anyway, we'll leave it at that, and we're going to move to my conversation with Yoram Khazoni. Well, in the midst of all of the tumult here in Israel, I thought that the person to talk about this with is Dr. Yoram Khazoni, the author of Conservatism, a Rediscovery. You were here a couple of months ago to talk about your new book, and you're also the president of the Herzl Institute. So Yoram, thanks so much for joining me again on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Caroline.
All right, well, we're catching him just before he goes to the States to speak at a university in Texas, so I'm feeling pretty lucky to have you here, because, one of the real questions that a lot of people are asking themselves, I know I am, is when you look at the people out rioting, and the media screaming and saying, 100,000, 200,000. Yesterday I saw a graphic that said 371,000 people. Uh-huh. I don't know. It's amazing. 371,000 people were out in Tel Aviv, and then Ehud Barak said there were 400,000. What is driving this? I don't feel when you look at the numbers, you also look at the polls. There was a direct polls survey that came out Friday morning that said that support for judicial reform among the members of the opposition, that is, people who voted against the Netanyahu government, has risen 20 points between February and March. So the public actually supports judicial reform. In theory, they want more agreement, less agreement, but the crowds keep coming. People are talking about feeling broken by judicial reform package, which when you look at the details of it is extremely moderate. How do you look at it? What is this fight really about? Why is it happening, and why is it so spasmodically angry and increasingly violent?
Well, I think we need to look at it at least from two different angles. On the one hand, there's the very real substantive local issues here in Israel that we're dealing with. But on the other hand, this resistance is, obvious. I mean, it's naming itself the resistance.
Right.
It's a direct imitation of the resistance to, Donald Trump in 2016, the resistance to Brexit in beginning in 2016. So it's also an international phenomenon. It's a I don't want to say copycat because there really are important issues that we can get into for the future of Israel. But the first thing to understand is that this is a repetition of something that's happening in country after country. It is a crisis of Western democracy in a very, very real sense. That the assumption of a democratic system is that if I win the election, then you'll be the loyal opposition, which means, you may object, but you'll let me govern. And then the next time, if you win the election, then I'll be the loyal opposition. So I can object, I can use parliamentary efforts in order to block things you're doing. But in the end, I'll let you govern. That's the rules of the democratic game. The reason we do that is because we assume that kind of peaceful support of the people who maybe we don't agree with, maybe we detest them, but the peaceful support when we're in opposition, we understand that that's what makes democracy work, and that democracy is good because it's better than fighting it out in the streets, than actual physical violence. And here in all three of these cases, first in the United States and Britain, and now in Israel, we're seeing an escalating rhetoric that begins with resistance. You're not legitimate. The government's not legitimate. So the regular democratic rules don't apply, which means that I don't have to be loyal to this country anymore. And that's what we're hearing, at least in the rhetoric in Israel. This is unprecedented. It's a dictatorship. Because it's a dictatorship, then we're allowed to use methods that we've never used before. That's where we've come.
Well, so they reject basic democratic principles. I mean, like even you see it in the ratings of who's participating in Knesset debates. You see that Yair Lapid is out of 120, he's 118. And the two people who have less attendance than he has are sick. And Merav Michaeli, the head of the Labor Party, is ranked 109th. And so, you have non-involvement in the debates, in the functioning of the parliament. They're not participating in any committee hearings. They're not presenting anything, any legislation, any objections, nothing. All of their operation is in the street. It's in the media, so that they've opted out of it from a political perspective. And so you definitely are seeing that. But why? So, why is this happening? Why is it that the left in Britain, in Israel, in the United States, very recently, did it start in 2016? Did it start before that? Did it start in 2000 when they said that Gore actually won and it was all a lie in Florida? I mean, there's an increased effort by Democrats in the United States not to recognize the legitimacy of elections the minute that a Republican wins, at least from 2000. So why do you think this is happening?
Well, look, the case of 2000 was a very narrow contested election, and in that kind of situation where the election is extremely close, it's not terribly surprising that people bring examples of
Hanging chads was
right. No,
at the time.
things that look like the election really should have gone the other way. I don't think that's too surprising. The Democrats did not, once Bush became president, they didn't continue to insist on a resistance, on the illegitimacy of his government, on burning things, and that's not what happened. It was still very much within the rules of the democratic framework, where one side wins, the other side loses, and they're the loyal opposition for the next X years up until things change. So, I think 2016 is a clear watershed, and the question is why? What is it about? So, I think the easiest way to understand this is after the Cold War, there was what you can call liberal internationalist consensus. Both Republicans and Democrats in Britain, the Tories and the Labour, everybody kind of settled into this agreement that the basic thing that was going to happen is we're going to bring peace to the world and to mankind. We're going to take down the borders. We're going to have free trade. We're
The Francis Fukuyama kind of
we're going to guarantee human rights, and where that's not working, then we'll send in our troops and make it work. And that model was kind of among elites, among the educated people who are involved in political decision making. That model was accepted, both center-left and center-right, which means that, let's say, from 1990, from the time that Margaret Thatcher was removed as prime minister in Britain. Why? Because she didn't want to join the European Union. She didn't want to erase all the borders. She wanted to maintain national independence for Britain. From that moment, 1990, until 2016, there's virtually no real resistance to these two parties, left of center and right of center, which argue about all sorts of things, but they agree that we're going to move forward with this utopian project of removing power from national governments and giving it to international bodies, to the World Trade Organization, to the United Nations, to the European Union, a whole complex of international bodies which are dominated by the expertise of academics and lawyers, and make decisions without any public in any nation voting for it.
Sort of like the Oslo process here that began in 1993.
Yeah, look, the Oslo process in 1993 is certainly a part of the picture. In 1990, George H.W. Bush declares the New World Order.
Right.
And in 1992, we get the Treaty of Maastricht, which is part of the New World Order. They say, okay, so we don't need borders anymore. We're going to unify, like all the nations of Europe are going to become like one big undifferentiated mass, and then we're going to expand it. And the whole issue of bringing China into the World Trade Organization as an equal, because that's going to bring liberalism and democracy, which was also happening at the same time. China was officially accepted only in 2001, but the same argument.
94, I think it was. They started the.
Right, the process was 94, 95. And so in Israel, we saw the same thing, that Shimon Peres in 1995 writes his book, The New Middle East, in which he makes the same liberal argument that they're making in Europe. He says, let's take down all the borders in the Middle East, and liberal Jews and liberal Arabs will unite. We'll have like a joint army. We'll oppose the fundamentalist loonies, both Jewish and Muslim. That's what the book was about. Not too many Israelis bought believed the message of that book. I think Israelis are a little bit closer to war than that. But still, the flood of utopian thinking, which was washing over America and Europe and all the democracies, it hit us as well. And the Oslo Accords are clearly, I wrote about this in my book, The Jewish State. The Oslo Accords were clearly this kind of utopian thinking. There's a terrorist organization. It's murdered lots and lots of people, but we can just shake hands with them and bring them here into this 40-mile wide territory that's right. The state of Israel. We'll give them like a local government. The belief that peace would come of that is part certainly,
and economic prosperity, right? That was
right.
the whole, and it continues to be the guiding concept. We'll give them money, we'll make them awash with bucks, with euros and shekels, and they'll.
Well, it's not just Oslo. I mean, the formula when people who are leaning in this globalist, liberal internationalist direction, the formula is always, look. Why would people give up their national sovereignty, their independence, their control of their own borders, the demographic composition of their nation, their inherited traditions of the way to do things? Why would they give these things up? And the answer that you always get is, well, it's the only rational thing to do because this will bring peace and prosperity. We'll bring peace and prosperity to the whole globe, and if you oppose it. If you're going to fight against it, if you're going to say, well, no, I prefer my national identity, I prefer my independence, I prefer my inheritance, then the liberal internationalists look at you, and you can understand it from their perspective. They look at you and they say, I'm offering you peace and prosperity, and you're rejecting peace and prosperity in order to, for your identity. That's like primitive tribal stuff, and it makes them angry. Like, why are you standing?
But the tribal primitive stuff only came up really or flooded over in 2016 in the West, and probably earlier in 2000 here with the death of, with the complete destruction of the Oslo concept, with the Palestinian terror war, because it didn't work. I mean, China didn't become America. If anything, I mean, China became much more totalitarian after Xi Jinping came to power, and they are a surveillance state, the likes of which George Orwell never dreamt of. And if anything, the United States and Europe are becoming closer to that model than the other way around. So that there's obviously an ocean of distinction, but what we're seeing with the Twitter files and everything like that, of government censorship, misinformation czars, all of these things, this was something that was unthinkable a decade ago, and it's happening now in Biden's America. So we're seeing that the nationalist impulse may have always been latent, but I think it began to rise because the internationalist concept failed.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely think that's true. I mean, the in country after country, and we can add to America, Britain, and Israel. We can add to the picture Giorgia Meloni in Italy, and Viktor Orban in Hungary, and we could name some others. But and I'm not saying that every one of these is identical. Each one's a somewhat different case, but in general, what all of these politicians are building themselves on, and you can now say the same thing about DeSantis in the United States. He's challenging Trump, but if you look at his message is certainly within the same school of Meloni and Orban and Trump and Netanyahu. There is a school of nationalist politics whose focus is to say, look, globalism, what it's done is it's taken away the capacity of national governments to make the decisions for their people. Okay, because basically what's happening is you're saying, no, there's this principle of free trade, or that the World Trade Organization is in charge of, or this principle of human rights, which is, various international courts are going to make the decisions. And what the bottom line is that nations can't make their own decisions. So in 2016, the probably the most urgent issue at that moment, I mean, it's still urgent, but the thing that really woke people up was on immigration. Because as you move towards this liberal internationalist view where, all people on earth are created equal. Okay, so that may be true that all people are equal in God's eyes, but the policy of saying that, well, you can't shoot people at the border. You can't close the borders to them because they have a right to live in peace and prosperity just like we do. So the immigration issue became the first clear issue in which Americans and Brits and Europeans started to feel like, I've completely lost control of who lives in my country and what the public culture is going to be and who has an economic right to be here, who has a right to be here at all. That was the first issue. And then on top of that, you're right that there are these crucial problems with the model of free trade where the economic model of free trade doesn't take into account questions like, well, what happens if the Chinese have a comparative advantage because the labor there is incredibly cheap, and then all the factories start to leave the United States and Europe and go to China. Now, what we were told at the time in the 1990s was that that's not a problem because if the factories leave the United States, they'll be replaced because people will take the resources that have been made available. They'll retrain the workers, and then there'll be higher level kinds of industry, which will just keep the Americans and Europeans way ahead of China. So that promise, that's an economic promise, in addition to the claim that China would become a liberal democracy. But that economic promise was false. I mean, it hit really hard. It turns out that if you close a factory in some town in the Midwest or in the north of England, if you close a factory, then it doesn't simply it doesn't simply get replaced by some better, higher paying employment or retraining. Nothing like that happens. So those two things, immigration and anger over the fact that with these employment problems that governments are continuing to depress the labor market by allowing larger and larger amounts of immigration without any question of are these new immigrants, are they going to become just like normal Americans and Brits, or are they going to have kind of their own closed communities and culture which will be in competition?
So here in Israel we had, so I said we had the Oslo Paradigm, which failed abysmally. I mean, the idea that you could bring terrorists into Judea and Samaria and Gaza, give them guns, and they would take care of terrorism for us was so stupid, but it was this concept that people wanted to believe. And at the same time, I mean, right at the outset of the 1990s, after the Cold War, you also had Aaron Barak, who said, well, a judge in a democracy is actually the high priest, and he has to be above the elected leadership of a country and dictate values and first principles of a society from the bench based on his higher understanding of right and wrong that he gained because he's enlightened. And right. I mean, that remains the judicial philosophy that guides the legal fraternity in Israel, led by the Supreme Court, but that finds its echoes in its marks in the prosecution and the attorney general and all of the principal nodes of law enforcement in Israel. And those are the people now. So Oslo failed, but then they still had the second arm of the sort of liberal international Inc. Israel branch, which was the Judiciary. So now that's more falling apart. So how is that how you see it as well? That first Oslo fell, that wing of it, the peace wing, and now we have the societal, the social contract wing of it falling apart.
Yeah, for sure. When you think about Israel's judiciary, I think you have to notice two things. Okay, one is at the level of ideas, and the other is at the level of sociology, meaning like competing social groups. At the level of ideas, Aaron Barak constructed the Israeli Supreme Court in the image of the liberal internationalist professors, law professors and judges, who were at the forefront of trying to create this universal liberal order that's going to impose one rule of law. George H.W. Bush said this in 1990, that the rule of the jungle is going to be replaced by the rule of law.
Right.
There's going to be one system of law for the entire planet. And from that perspective, the Israeli judges in the 1990s, they didn't see themselves as, the judges who are whose responsibility is to uphold the traditional law and the sovereign decision-making of an independent Jewish state, the State of Israel. That wasn't what they're thinking. Their peer group is judges in Europe, judges and lawyers in Europe, and law professors in Europe who are designing this world liberal order. And so when, in 1992, when the basic laws protecting human rights were installed at the behest of of Aaron Barak and the legal establishment, their plan, which they were explicit about it by 1995, their plan was to take these basic laws and turn them into, for the first time, into the right of the Israeli Supreme Court to strike down not only legislation, but also any policy or any appointment of the executive or the legislative branches. In other words, by 1995, the Chief Justice of Israel's Supreme Court, Aaron Barak, explicitly in these words declared that this is a constitutional revolution. People don't remember that now, but some of us, I think, remember. He declared a constitutional revolution. He declared Israel to have a constitution with the strongest Supreme Court in the world. No democracy had a Supreme Court of the kind that Israel had beginning in 1995, after the Israeli Supreme Court declared that it has the right, on the basis of whatever, they have these human rights clauses in the basic laws, but the standard that they used in order to determine whether rights are being violated was whether, in their view, this was reasonable or not. They changed the rules of standing so that any citizen in the State of Israel had the right to appeal any law, any decision by the government, including appointments. I mean, that doesn't exist anywhere on earth. And so what you had beginning 1995 with the Constitutional Revolution was the imposition of liberal universal values by a court that recognized no actual barriers to its intervening. Because if on any issue whatsoever having to do with government or legislation, any citizen can appeal, that means that the Supreme Court can review any act by government whatsoever just because it feels like it. And they declared that they have the authority to make decisions. There's an appointment, they don't like the appointment, they nix it. There's a law, they don't like the law, they nix it. They created a dictatorship by liberal lawyers and protected it by an appointment process that doesn't allow democratic interference in the appointment of new justices.
Right. So, I mean, we've talked on this program a lot about that. But what but I think that the overarching concept of what this is really about is key, not only for understanding what's happening in Israel, but also for thinking about how the government has to handle this, because it isn't the scream, the sort of primordial scream that we're hearing all the time, when people refer to themselves as broken, that the government's judicial reform plan is breaking them emotionally, psychologically. And this drumbeat of propaganda by the left, the media, telling people that Israel is about to become a dictatorship, it's not about judicial selection. It's about who we are.
Yeah.
And it's sort of amazing to me that you can have an elite that has latched onto an idea that is not related to their own people. How does that play out in other places? How do you see the model that's happening in the United States translating here?
Well, I think it's roughly the same in every democratic country. The claim is that there is such a thing as universal values. And at first, these are liberal values. You may have noticed that they are, that as these liberal values become more progressive, they get more and more and more influenced by neo-Marxism. So there's what was at first a liberal resistance to nationalism, to conservatism, to traditionalism, to national independence. But since 2020, the liberal institutions, 2016 was one watershed because liberals poured into the streets to say, Brexit is illegitimate, Donald Trump is illegitimate, we're going to stop it. We're going to find a way to stop it because it's not part of normal democracy. It has to be stopped. That's why they're saying it's fascist, it's dictatorship, he's mentally ill, like he has no principles, like all of these slogans that the way that you can
and criminalizing them. He may be arrested this week, and Netanyahu was railroaded into a trial.
Right. So you can object reasonably, to various ideas that Trump or Netanyahu or the Brexiteers. You can object to ideas that they have. You can also object and say, look, I don't like this person's personality. That's not my view of who a president should be, or so on. But what we're talking about actually is what you just said, which is that the way that you know that that this is not about Trump's personality. That's a legitimate thing. I don't like Trump's personality. I don't think he would be a good president. But if someone said that, but the way that you know that it's not about that at all is that if you remove Trump and you go to Britain, you see exactly the same thing. You remove Trump and you go to Israel, you see exactly the same thing. You say, okay, so instead of Trump, it'll be DeSantis or Tucker Carlson or whoever, and the reactions are exactly the same. They're identical. Nothing changes, and that's how you know that it's not about a person. It's exactly what you said. First, you say, look, these people are not liberals. They're primitives. They're anti-democratic. They're going to impose a dictatorship. First, you make that argument. And by the way, I don't remember if I mentioned this the last time, but if you want to see the absolutely crystal clear moment when this transition is made from a two-party democracy to, no, only we're supposed to be elected. They're not allowed. They're illegitimate. The moment that this happens is in, I think it was February 2019, Robert Kagan writes a 10,000-word essay in the Washington Post, like this amazing thing, arguing, look, we've been allowing all sorts of variations, be different kinds of conservatism, but we have to just understand it has to be black and white. He says it has to be binary, and he repeats that over and over. We have to move to a binary form of thinking. Either you're with liberal democracy or you're with the dictators, right? That's his thesis, and he just goes through all of these people who you thought were conservative, William Buckley, Henry Kissinger, Russell Kirk, all these people that used to be legitimate conservatives, but he says, no, they're not legitimate. They're all basically, all of them, they're bringing dictatorship. And since they're bringing dictatorship, we have to say, if it's not liberal democracy, if it's not in our camp, then it's illegitimate. We have to fight it like it's illegitimate.
But what's so bizarre about that, right, is that, he was one of the people who was very supportive, championed the war in Iraq and the concept of liberal democracy being universally applicable and wanting to apply it to Iraq, wanting to apply it to Egypt, wanting to apply it to the Palestinian Authority, wanting to apply it everywhere. And then everywhere that they applied it, you got the rise of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, etc., and it never worked. Time after time after time. This week, I think, or last week, we're marking 20 years to the invasion of Iraq. I think he just wrote another article, justifying the wrongness of his decision. But, so you have a situation where the people who support liberal internationalism have led their nations, whether it's here in Israel with the PLO, or in the United States with the wars in Iraq, any number of other things, the ouster of Muammar Gaddafi, and look at what's become of Libya now. They just said that all the raw uranium is missing from that country. All of these things, they totally got it wrong. And yet now they're saying that anybody who disputes them is evil, is trying to enslave women, is trying to transform their countries into dictatorships and are dark. And so what is driving their followers? I mean, it looks to me a lot of this is very reminiscent of like Arthur Miller's Crucible, where people are screaming. You have these hysterical people coming on television and essentially saying, I saw John Proctor with the devil. Everybody who isn't with them is the devil, is a witch. And there's a sense of hysteria in all of these countries. So I'm looking at it and, I have my ideas and I speak about them on the show, but, what do you think that the government has to do? Because they're dealing both with a psychological syndrome of like a captive audience that is listening to this stuff, and I think they're believing it.
Yeah.
And then you have a small but very, very powerful minority that's driving this bus off a cliff. They're saying, if it's not our way, we believe that you have to save the village, you have to burn it. Right. And that's what they're doing.
Yeah. So let me just make one point about the sociology of this, which is that Israel, as you know, was it was founded by the left. Okay, but the left in those days, in Ben-Gurion's days, the left were nationalists. They were pro-Jewish. During the 1970s, the left in Israel changed. It kind of overthrew. This is something that happened on purpose in the universities and the media. There's a new generation that overthrew the influence of its labor Zionist teachers. And it
was part of the new left that they latched onto the new left as opposed to the old socialist left.
Right. So the new 1970s left in Israel would be recognizable to our audience. It would be recognizable from who is the left today. I mean, they're progressive, but they're not socialists. They're in some aspects liberal, in some aspects interested in capitalism. They talk a lot about freedom and rights, much more than the socialists did, who were talking about justice in the old days. And so in the 1970s, Israel has the beginnings of a takeover of the Israeli left by liberals as opposed to the old labor Zionists. And what's the big shift? The big shift in Israel, besides that, obviously, is that in 1977, for the first time, Menachem Begin wins, and so there's for the first time there's conservative government. I mean, you can argue about how conservative Begin really was, but from the perspective certainly of the liberal elites, they see Begin bringing in all of the Edot Mizrach, the Mizrachim, the Sephardi Jews, the less educated part of the population, the religious Jews, all of the people that, on the American spectrum, Hillary Clinton calls them deplorables.
Right.
Okay, so 1977 is the first moment that Israel's deplorables, they win. They're in the government, and the truth is that with small exceptions, the Israeli government has been mostly dominated by the Sephardim and the religious, later by Russian immigrants. All of this coalition of outsiders has mostly dominated Israeli politics since then, and so part of understanding the aggressiveness and severity of Aaron Barak's constitutional revolution of the 1990s, part of understanding that is this liberal elite which sees the country politically being in the control of people they think are deplorables. It's the unenlightened, the uneducated. So let's say from 1992 until 2018, I would say. From 1992 until 2018, that was the status quo, was that mostly the governments are more conservative, but they're completely balanced by a Supreme Court that strikes down anything that it wants and makes any decisions, any legislative type decisions it wants.
And they don't even have to, because the Attorney General basically takes care of everything.
Right, the Attorney General sits in the cabinet meetings and blocks decisions by the government even before they get to the Supreme Court. So that was Israel's new constitution after the constitutional revolution from 1992 until 2018. What happens in 2018 is that we have the first serious constitutional rebellion of the majority, but with the passage of the Jewish state law. Right. And all you need to do if you really just want to get the whole picture, is ask, do the liberal elites who rule Israel through the Supreme Court and the universities and the media, do they accept this constitutional provision that was legally passed in 2018? The answer is no, they don't accept it. They kind of pretend that that's part of their view of democracy. But if you just talk to them, all you need to do is get someone who's a judge and talk to them, and they'll say, well, that's not really part of our Constitution. Now, how can it not really be part of our Constitution? It was duly passed according to the rules by the majority. But the reason they're saying it's not part of the Constitution is because the real Constitution is liberalism. Okay, so now what's happening? Now we're just a few years later. It's 2023, and what's finally happened is after 5 elections in which all the left of center parties, all the liberal parties adopted this anti-Trump resistance thing. They said, no Bibi, never Bibi. Bibi's never going to be the prime minister. He can't be elected. It doesn't matter if the majority wants him. He can't be elected. He's illegitimate. They come up with a million reasons why he's illegitimate. But the heart of it is they don't want to allow a situation where there's actually democratic process, where the majority can make decisions. They actually fear correctly that the judicial reform is going to remove, finally, the ultimate decision-making authority from an unelected liberal body and give it to the public.
See, I don't think that any of this is happening now by chance. I mean, I think, and I talked about this in my opening today, and I'd like your thoughts about it. I mean, I think that, as we see, we're part of something bigger than Israel, right? I mean, in terms of the liberal internationalist rearguard action against their own people in country after country after country, not accepting, throwing out the rules of the game of democracy when, in order to continue to wield power or block the other side from ever wielding power if and when it wins an election. Right now, from a regional perspective, from a strategic perspective, while they're doing this rearguard action here and in America and in other countries, their liberal world order is being supplanted by a communist Chinese world order. The United States just lost. I mean, like unbeknownst to the Israeli public, the Americans, except I spoke about it on Saturday night on Channel 14. I'm not sure that other people have. It's just that America lost its preeminence in the Middle East the minute that Beijing mediated the dispute between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And the United States can do nothing other than, cheer on the sidelines because they've decided not to be the leaders of the Middle East any longer for a whole host of reasons. And now they're being challenged by the Chinese with Xi's visit to Moscow and the talk afoot that he's going to bring a ceasefire to the war between Ukraine and Russia. And if that actually happens, I think then, you could sort of say that NATO has become increasingly obsolete or unimportant. I mean, America's being supplanted in Europe if that happens by China. So you're seeing that, their own world order is just crumbled, and Iran is rising as a regional hegemon. We're under severe threat from the north, from Iran's Lebanese proxy, so that this is the time when facing this new terrible strategic reality, Israel is in the throes of domestic convulsions, the likes of which we haven't seen, that make it very difficult as a practical matter for the government to trust that the IDF will actually obey its orders, that the police will obey its orders, or that the public will accept the legitimacy of its decisions if we find ourselves in a position where we either have to initiate military operations against Iran or fight in a war with Iran's proxies at our doorstep.
Right. I think that's a very clear-eyed description. Let me just add the following question about Chinese influence. My friends and my nationalist conservative, my NatCon friends in Washington, when they look at the Senate, the U.S. Senate, and they count how many votes do they have, how many votes can they count on to take steps against China, to take serious steps in order to restrain Chinese influence in the United States. When I say Chinese influence, I mean just like everything in Washington, one way or another. When you talk to people in Washington and you talk to them about Chinese influence, what people say to you is, well, I guess that would have to include me. I mean, that's the first thing they say, because part of bringing China into the World Trade Organization and opening the Chinese economy to American corporations, I mean, really it was opening for them to move there. But part of it is that so much of the entire American elite is making money off of the relationship with China. They don't want to fight. They don't want to resist. They don't want to struggle because they personally are interested. Now, I'm not saying everybody's like that, but my friends who tell me how many senators can we rely on? They say 11. Okay, meaning half the Senate roughly is Republican. It's not just the Democrats. Half the Senate is Republican, but they can only come up with 11 votes that they can count on that understand the problem of China. So I mean, a question that I keep asking people, because I don't know the reality, but I think I know I think I know something when I look at the American war fever, the almost monolithic insistence by Democrats and most Republicans that the United States has to be fighting Russia as though Russia is the main enemy. To me, it just looks super obvious. Who gains from the United States thinking that the big enemy is Russia? China, the Chinese. And China's 10 times the threat that Russia is. Russia's not an actual threat to the United States. Even these scenarios where if Russia wins in Ukraine, Russia invaded Ukraine, right? I mean, I don't think there's any question that this was
a war of aggression.
A war of aggression by an imperialist power. Like, all of that's clear. What's not clear is if they swallow Ukraine, then are they really going to invade Poland? And that's
the part that isn't clear.
Yeah,
how expansive their imperialist designs are.
All this rhetoric that that if we lose in Ukraine, then Russia's going to be a threat to the United States. Look, to me, people should raise those questions, but I think the answer is pretty clear that the real threat is China.
But wait,
you're asking what?
Just to go back to Israel for a second, when we're facing this situation, and we have an open revolt of our elites here against the concept of national sovereignty, against Zionism, against the idea. I mean, that's really what it is. It's putting checks and balances on the judiciary, means bringing them, I've spoken about this before, from the level of oligarchy that's on top of our elected leaders into balance with them, so that everybody has their lane, and they have a lane and they're in it. They're an independent judiciary. They're simply not the high priests of Israel. And when you look at the tumult here in our streets and in our newsrooms and in the elite salons of this country, at a time of maximum peril. I mean, Gadi Eisenkot, who's no man of the right, and he wasn't a very good chief of staff of the IDF, in my opinion. Now he's a member of Knesset from Benny Gantz's party. And he says we haven't been in this much danger since the Yom Kippur War in 1973. What would if you were to advise Netanyahu today? What would you tell him to do?
Well, look, I have a problem advising Netanyahu because Netanyahu, his traditional historic preference is for including members of the center left in his governments. Okay. By the way, it's not just Netanyahu. I mean, this is a tradition going back to Ben Gurion, that most prime ministers understand that their government will be more stable and be able to lead things in the direction of consensus if they don't build it with just only parties from the right or only parties from the left. So traditionally, Bibi's always negotiating, just like Shamir did, just like Begin did, just like Golda Meir did, just like Ben Gurion. Bibi always turns to the center left and tries to bring at least one or two parties from there in. And if he's going to lose somebody on the right, so it happens. That's his preference. You can like it or dislike it. That's Bibi. That's Bibi Netanyahu. Why is he in the situation that he's in? Okay, I mean, I'm a supporter of the legal reform. I've been a supporter of the legal reform for more than 20 years. But if we're asking about the hysteria and the saying this is illegitimate and the emotional crisis and all of that, what's responsible? Who's responsible? People who say Israel is in the worst, like you just quoted Eisenkot. Israel is in this terrible, awful situation of emergency with respect to the strategic situation with Iran, and that should be the first priority. If people are saying that, Eisenkot has a way to make it the first priority. All he has to do is pick up the phone to Bibi and say, "Look, I want to bring my party into the coalition. Let's start negotiating something that's going to prioritize the Iran problem instead of the judicial problem." Now, I'm not saying that Israel really should back off from judicial reforms. I think they're necessary, but it's the boycott. It's the boycott by all the left of center parties who are not willing to talk to Bibi about joining his government, saying that he's illegitimate. So how can they, they're both saying Bibi's illegitimate, so we're not joining your party, and they're saying, look, Bibi's government is being held hostage by the rightist and religious parties. But
Right.
they created that situation. Right. So look, I do think that after an entire generation of the Supreme Court being, as you say, the ruling liberal hierarchy, and we know by looking at America and Europe that it's only going to be liberal for another couple of years. Here in Israel, it's going to become woke, just like
already is.
Just like all of the just like, look, every significant liberal institution in America and Europe has gone woke in the last 5 years. Every single last major institution. So you can say, well, no, there's pushback on Twitter. No, there's pushback in some institutions in Florida. So there's some pushback, but we have to be realistic. Liberalism has collapsed in the face of this new woke tyranny, and it's going to come to Israel, and it's going to take over all the liberal institutions in Israel, just like it did everywhere else. And in this situation, I don't think Israel can afford not to have the judicial reform, because if we don't have the judicial reform, we're going to have a Supreme Court which is, some form of neo-Marxism that has no compunction at all about hammering this neo-Marxism onto Israel. Their agenda is already Israel shouldn't be a Jewish state.
Right.
But this is use force in order to turn it into a neo-Marxist state. So we don't really have very much choice. Your analysis of the strategic situation is correct. We really do have to deal with Iran in a way that's parallel to America needs to deal with China. We have one major rival in our region that has the capacity to do tremendous harm, and we have to deal with that. But we're not going to be able to just put the judicial reform off. So what would I recommend? Look, the devil's in the details. Not every single thing that is that's in the judicial reform package, has to be passed now. Okay, so there might be ways of softening it, but if softening it means that the Supreme Court continues to be the ruling branch of government in Israel, with the ability to nix anything that the country wants, we can't afford it. We can't afford it. So basically, what do I tell Bibi? Not that he's asking me, but I would tell Bibi that the reform has to go through in one form or another, and that's going to strengthen Israel in the end. But we have a ways to go.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. Just one last question. In my view, is that Netanyahu has to rally the people who are feeling broken, and he has to reinstate in them their ancient memories of who they were and who they are and who their parents were and who their grandparents were and what Zionism is, and reinvest them in the Zionist enterprise and rally them and explain that the court reform is about bringing us together, which I think it is, and that the court is putting us apart. And I think that, but that is contingent, I suspect, on the success of such an endeavor is contingent on there being a sufficient number of people who are broken, who are also Zionist and have not been transformed into liberal internationalists over the past generation, to be able to be appeased.
Okay, but
listen.
You know that here in Israel, the special characteristics of the local crisis have a lot to do with personal damaged relationships between Bibi and a lot of the people who are trying to get rid of them, get rid of him, because it's not just
right.
that like in America that they look at Trump and they say, oh, he's dictatorial and all of it. It's not just that. These are actual personalities. A lot of the heads of these smaller parties on the center left are people who used to be in the Likud. They used to be people who served in Bibi's governments. And they detest him for reasons that are, in some cases, completely irrational.
Right.
And which doesn't mean that, that there wasn't some reason that they ended up detesting him. But these are not ideological motives in the first instance. They're personal.
They're psychiatric.
These are personal issues. And so... look, I do think that ultimately Bibi needs to bring, I don't know what the time frame is, but Bibi's going to have to bring some left of center party into his government. And I think that he has to pass important pieces of the judicial reform
Before that happens.
Because otherwise it's never going to happen.
Right.
And but if he passes parts of it, then he can turn to Gantz or Eisenkot or various other people and say, look, you want me to keep going? If you don't want me to keep going, then join my government.
No, that's a good one. I think that's a plan. All right. Well, Dr. Yoram Khazoni, the author of Conservatism, Rediscovery, and the president of the Herzl Institute, I wish you good travels and successful ones, and come back, and we'll have you back on the Caroline Glick Show to pick up the wreckage of this country after all of this pans out. I'm sure it'll be fine. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. And we will see you guys again next week for another Caroline Glick Show. Thanks so much.